Imagine this. A woman walks into a room and without a single word, the air around her changes. Conversations falter. Eyes follow her, though she does not seek them. There is no dramatic gesture, no forced smile, no desperate reach for attention, only an unshakable stillness that bends the social atmosphere around her. This is not the charm of the coquettish, nor the loud magnetism of the performer. It is something far more dangerous to the fragile ego of a man who relies on dominance for his sense of worth. It is the energy of the sovereign feminine, and it can shatter his self-image without a single spoken syllable. Her power is not born from conquest, but from a deep and private knowing of her own value. In Jungian terms, she is the embodiment of the anima in its mature form, the image of the feminine that exists in the psyche of every man, stripped of distortion, no longer a projection for him to possess or define. When a man encounters such a woman, his unconscious mind recognizes something he cannot control, something that refuses to bend into the role his ego demands. And that recognition can create a collapse within him, because she reflects the truth he avoids. His worth is not affirmed by ownership of another. The sovereign feminine does not compete for approval. She does not signal availability through subtle self-erasure. Her silence is not passive. It is the silence of a queen who knows she commands without pleading. Her eyes do not dart in search of validation. They rest, steady, as though the entire scene is a painting she can step away from at any moment. This unnerves the insecure masculine, for he is accustomed to a dance where women must overextend themselves to hold his gaze. When she withholds that dance, his ego finds no familiar rhythm, and panic begins to grow in the shadows of his mind. There is a reason Jung described the process of individuation as a confrontation with the shadow. For the man whose identity is built on control, the sovereign feminine forces that confrontation. Without aggression, without argument, she reveals the fault lines in his self-perception. In her presence, the inflated masculine image cannot find a foothold. He may grow irritable, overly charming, or suddenly withdrawn, not realizing that the source of his discomfort is not her rejection, but the mirror she holds to the fragility he keeps hidden. Her aura is not an act, it is the residue of inner work. She has faced her own shadow, stripped the layers of false self born from people-pleasing, fear of abandonment, and inherited stories about what a woman should be. She has walked through the valley of self-doubt and emerged with the crown of self-trust. This crown is invisible, but its weight shapes her posture, her tone, her pace of movement. She does not need to rush to fill silence. She allows the air between words to stretch, knowing that tension is not something to escape, but something to inhabit. For the listener, this is where the lesson sharpens. To embody this energy is not to manipulate or play cold games. It is to live from the marrow-deep belief that nothing external can dictate one's value. The sovereign feminine does not use silence as a weapon, but as a sanctuary. In this sanctuary, she holds herself as sacred. She refuses to perform for attention, because she has learned that performance is the slowest form of self-abandonment. And when a man senses this refusal, his ego trembles, for he realizes he has no power to script her role in his story. Yet the reaction is not always conscious. Some men will experience her presence as irresistible fascination, drawn to the mystery without knowing why. Others will feel discomfort, even resentment, unable to explain why her lack of interest feels like an attack. Both are signs of the same psychic truth. She has not agreed to be an object in his theater. She is not a mirror for his fantasies. She is a mirror for his blind spots. And the more inflated his sense of dominance, the sharper that reflection will cut. This dynamic is not limited to romantic tension. It is present in every sphere where insecure power meets unshakable self-possession. In workplaces, in friendships, even in family systems, the sovereign feminine silence exposes the noise of others' insecurities. It is not about confrontation. It is about the quiet, relentless presence of someone who refuses to shrink. In that refusal, she becomes both a threat and an invitation. A threat to the false self, an invitation to authenticity. The deeper truth is that her presence does not cause the ego collapse, it reveals it. The collapse was inevitable, built into the cracks of a self-image too dependent on control. She is simply the still water in which that distorted image can no longer hold its shape. And for the one on the receiving end, the choice is stark. Resist and grow bitter, or surrender and grow whole. But what happens when such a woman meets not an insecure ego, but a man who has also face? His shadow. What alchemy unfolds when two sovereigns recognize each other, not as possessions but as equals? When two sovereigns meet, the air between them does not hum with the tension of conquest, but with the quiet electricity of recognition. There is no scrambling to prove worth, no hidden battle for dominance, no subtle fishing for reassurance. Instead, there is a deep, steady gaze that says without words, "I see you, and I do not need to own you to value you." In this meeting, there is no ego collapse, only ego dissolution, the melting away of the masks each once wore in the presence of the unawakened. This is the rare moment when the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine archetypes, are no longer in distorted projection, but in harmony. In Jung's language, this is the beginning of true individuation, a stage where a man no longer seeks a woman to complete him, but to walk beside him, and where a woman no longer seeks validation through being chosen, but chooses herself first. The sovereign feminine recognizes this instantly, because she has seen the opposite far too often. The man whose flattery masks insecurity, whose pursuit masks the fear of being left, whose charm is nothing more than camouflage for control. In contrast, the sovereign man's energy feels like a still river, deep, unthreatened, and free-flowing. To the untrained eye, such an encounter might seem almost uneventful. There is no heated performance, no power struggle, no dramatic chase. But beneath the surface, something rare unfolds. Two psyches meeting without the interference of unhealed wounds. In this space, attraction is not born of scarcity, but of abundance. The woman does not feel the need to soften herself to avoid triggering insecurity, and the man does not need to inflate himself to keep her interest. Instead, both stand in the full architecture of who they are, and from that fullness, connection grows without corrosion. Yet this dynamic is so rare because the world trains both men and women to operate from ego defense rather than from sovereignty. From childhood, the feminine is often told to smile, to please, to make herself agreeable in order to be safe or loved. The masculine is often told to dominate, to win, to suppress vulnerability in order to be respected. These scripts are deeply embedded in the shadow, hidden from conscious awareness, but dictating behavior in every relationship. For the sovereign feminine, her journey has been to burn that script, to rewrite her instincts so they align with truth rather than conditioning. When she stands in her full presence with a man who has done the same work, there is no collapse because there is no false self left to collapse. What falls away instead is the tension of performance, the exhausting need to guard or grasp. In this atmosphere, words become fewer, but heavier in meaning. Silence is no longer a power play. It is a shared space where both can breathe without fear of losing ground. And this is perhaps the most intoxicating element of such a connection. Neither person is chasing safety through control, because both have already built that safety within. This kind of union does not mean conflict disappears. In fact, it allows for a more honest form of conflict, one that is not about defending ego wounds, but about navigating genuine differences. The sovereign feminine does not retreat into manipulation when challenged, and the sovereign man does not retreat into aggression or withdrawal. Instead, each trusts that disagreement does not threaten the bond, because the bond was never built on fear in the first place. This is a connection where boundaries are not punishments, but expressions of self-respect, where desire is not a game of scarcity, but an outpouring of mutual recognition. For those who have not yet met this kind of resonance, the temptation is to romanticize it as a mythical rarity, something that either arrives by fate or not at all. But the truth is sharper. Such a meeting can only occur when both have already faced the discomfort of dismantling their ego armor. And that dismantling is often the most grueling work of a lifetime. It means confronting the shadow parts that manipulate, seduce, or control in order to avoid vulnerability. It means enduring the loneliness that comes when no one in your current life can meet you at the level you now require. It means saying no over and over to people who might adore you, but cannot honor you. This is why the sovereign feminine never wastes energy convincing a man to rise to meet her. She knows that transformation cannot be begged or bargained into existence. The insecure man must reach his own breaking point, his own confrontation with the emptiness of ego games, before he can see her not as a threat, but as an equal. Until then, she will remain untouchable, not because she is cold, but because her warmth is sacred, and she will not pour it into a vessel that leaks. And so, the true power of the Sove, reign feminine, is not only in creating ego collapse in the unready, it is in calling forth the full presence of those who are. Her silence to one man is a mirror of inadequacy, but to another, it is an invitation into depth. The difference lies not in her, but in the level of self-awareness of the one before her. This is why she does not seek, does not chase, and does not lower her crown. She knows that the only man who can truly meet her is the one who does not fear losing her, because he does not need to own her to value her. But here lies the question that burns in the minds of those who witness her. If this kind of resonance is so rare, how does she navigate the long stretches of solitude without losing the softness that makes her presence so magnetic? She navigates it by refusing to see solitude as an absence. To her, solitude is not a barren desert, but a fertile field where the roots of her sovereignty deepen. In the stillness of her own company, she cultivates the qualities that make her unshakable in the presence of others. It is here, in the quiet hours, that she learns to hear the subtle movements of her own mind, to feel the ebb and flow of her own emotions without rushing to distract or numb herself. This discipline of presence becomes her shield, her compass, and her sanctuary. In Jungian terms, solitude allows the integration of her shadow, the parts of herself that once clung to approval, feared abandonment, or overgave in hopes of being chosen. In the company of her own silence, these fragments are not suppressed, but embraced, understood, and transformed. She learns that her value does not fluctuate with someone else's attention. She learns that the ache of longing does not need to be extinguished, but can be held with dignity. This is the alchemy that turns loneliness into self-possession. For the unsovereign, solitude is a mirror too sharp to face. Without external validation, the ego withers, the mind panics, the old wounds scream for distraction. But for her, solitude is a forge. She emerges from it tempered, refined, and immune to the cheap currencies of false affection. She no longer entertains the illusion that companionship is proof of worth. Instead, she sees it as a choice made from abundance, not desperation. In this way, she is never waiting for someone to arrive. She is living fully in the kingdom she has built within. This inner kingdom is not cold marble and empty halls. It is alive with the richness of her own cultivated passions. She invests in her craft, her body, her friendships, her spiritual depth. She becomes the curator of her own life, arranging it not to impress but to nourish. And because she is not starving for connection, The people she allows in are those who bring genuine value, not those who simply fill silence. This is the root of her magnetic presence. She is not trying to draw anyone in, yet her fullness draws others like water in a drought. When an insecure man encounters her in this state, he feels an unsettling contrast. He is used to women signaling need, responding eagerly to crumbs, bending themselves into the shape he desires. She does none of these things. Her self-sufficiency exposes his dependence on validation, and in that exposure he may grow defensive or dismissive. He may label her as aloof or too much, unable to see that what he calls too much is simply a woman who will not shrink to soothe his fragility. This is where the ego collapse deepens. It is not simply about rejection. It is about the destabilization of an entire belief system. The insecure man's identity often rests on the assumption that he is the chooser, the prize, the one who decides a woman's worth through his attention. When she neither competes for it nor reacts to its withdrawal, he is left without his usual script. The collapse is not in losing her. It is in realizing he was never in control to begin with. Her power, however, is not in the collapse itself, but in her indifference to it. She does not seek revenge, does not gloat, does not linger to witness the unraveling. Her focus remains on her own path, for she understands that every man must walk his own journey towards self-awareness. Some will resist and cling to the old games. Others will begin the slow, uncomfortable work of facing their shadow. Either way, she does not make his growth her responsibility. But the question remains for those observing her from the outside. Does this constant self-reliance risk closing her off from connection altogether? Does she become so fortified in her solitude that no one can reach her? The truth is more nuanced. She is not guarded, she is discerning. She is not walled, she is gated, and the key is not flattery or persistence, but presence. She opens not to those who demand entry, but to those who arrive with respect for what they are entering. And when someone does meet her at that level, the connection is not a merging, but a meeting. She does not lose herself to love, nor does she dilute her truth to maintain it. Instead, she allows intimacy to expand her sovereignty rather than erode it. This is why her relationships, whether fleeting or lifelong, leave an indelible mark. She does not give herself lightly, but when she does, it is with the full force of a woman who has nothing to prove and nothing to fear losing. Yet there is a paradox at the heart of her existence. The very qualities that make her irresistible to the awakened also make her invisible to the unawakened. She is not loud in her power, does not advertise her worth, and so many pass her by, unaware of what they have missed. But those who do see her, truly see her, understand immediately that she is unlike the rest. And for them, the question is not whether they want her attention, but whether they can stand in its light without shrinking. So what happens when an insecure man, having faced his ego collapse, seeks to re-enter her world transformed? Can he be received anew, or does the past forever mark the threshold between them? If he returns transformed, it is not the same man who once stood before her. The old version, the one who hid behind charm, behind dominance, behind the need to be affirmed, has been burned away in the fires of his own reckoning. In its place stands someone whose worth no longer depends on ownership, whose gaze no longer demands submission, whose presence does not press upon hers but meets it. The sovereign feminine will see this immediately, not because he proclaims it, but because it radiates from the way he moves, the way he listens, the way he exists without reaching to possess. But transformation in her eyes is not measured by words or promises. It is measured by consistency. Many have spoken of change to slip past her gates, only to revert to old patterns when the thrill of pursuit fades. A man who has truly faced his shadow does not need to declare himself healed. His steadiness reveals it. He no longer flinches at her silence, no longer interprets her boundaries as rejection, no longer tries to coax her into shrinking so he can feel larger. Instead, he delights in the expanse of her, knowing it does not diminish his own. For the sovereign feminine, this recognition is not about forgiving the past in some sentimental wave of grace. It is about discerning whether the man before her can now meet her in the present without pulling her into a role she has long since discarded. If he can, then the door is not barred. Sovereignty does not cling to grudges. It simply refuses to step backward into smaller versions of itself. And if his transformation is genuine, she will not hold him to the sins of his unawakened self. She will see him as he stands now, not as the echo of who he was. In Jungian terms, what has shifted is the integration of the animus within him, the inner feminine principle that allows him to relate without domination, to connect without conquest. This integration softens his edges without weakening his strength. It allows him to stand as a sovereign in his own right, making him not a threat to her independence but a complement to it. In such a pairing, the dance is no longer predator and prey, nor hunter and hunted. It is two whole beings moving in harmony, aware of their power but unwilling to use it to cage one another. Yet this return is rare, for it demands that a man endure the death of an identity that once served him. It requires him to sit in the emptiness left behind when his ego collapses, to resist the urge to rebuild it with the same brittle materials. Many cannot bear that void, rushing instead to find someone new who will play the old game. But those who can remain in that space long enough to rebuild from truth emerge changed, not polished, not perfected, but stripped of the illusions that once governed them. When such a man comes back into her life, it is not to reclaim her but to offer himself without demand. He does not arrive with the energy of conquest but with the energy of collaboration. He does not promise her a pedestal. He offers her a partnership in which both stand on equal ground. And for the sovereign feminine, this is the only kind of union worth opening her gates for, not because she needs it, but because it amplifies what she already is. Still, even in the presence of genuine transformation, she remains rooted in her own center. She does not leap into his arms as though the story has finally reached its long-awaited climax. She observes. She feels. She lets time reveal what the initial meeting cannot. For she knows that sovereignty is not only about choosing with discernment, it is about allowing the truth of a person to emerge through the slow unfolding of days, not the intoxication of moments. To the outside world, this may look like caution, perhaps even detachment. But in truth, it is the deepest form of respect for herself, for him, and for the connection itself. She does not seek to rush what is meant to be timeless, for she understands that the strongest structures are those built stone by stone, not conjured overnight. And if his transformation holds through the seasons, if his steadiness endures through both calm and storm, then the meeting of two sovereigns can begin in earnest. When that happens, the dynamic shifts from the energy of collapse to the energy of expansion. There is no longer a need to dismantle illusions, for both have already done that work within themselves. Instead, their connection becomes a mirror not of inadequacy, but of possibility, reflecting back the highest selves they have each fought to become. In this space, love is not a transaction but a celebration. It is not a contract of needs but a covenant of freedom. Yet for the sovereign feminine, the door to such union will always remain selective, for she knows what it costs to maintain her crown. And even in the presence of a man who has transformed, she will never abandon the truth that her worth was never waiting on him to return. The question she holds is never, will he come back changed? But can he remain himself when faced with the full force of who I am? And perhaps the more haunting question is this: when two sovereigns meet, can they withstand the magnitude of what they might create together without falling back into the comfort of smaller selves? When two sovereigns stand together, the air between them feels different, thicker, charged, yet strangely calm. There is no scramble for position, no unspoken hierarchy, no silent tallying of who gives more or holds more power. Instead, there is an unhurried exchange, as if both know there is nowhere else they need to be. This calm is not the absence of intensity, it is the mastery of it. It is what happens when two people meet without the ghosts of past wounds whispering in their ears, without the need to manipulate the other into confirming an identity they've outgrown. In such a meeting, attraction does not burn in desperate flashes. It smolders steadily, like an ember that refuses to fade. The energy between them is not one of possession but of expansion. Each leaves the other's world larger than they found it. In the archetypal sense, this is the sacred union, the integration of the animus and anima within both, allowing them to connect without projection. She does not see him as the missing half of her soul, and he does not see her as the object of his completion. They see each other as whole, and from that wholeness they choose. Yet even in this equilibrium there is tension, not the tension of conflict, but the tension of potential. Both know that power, even when aligned, carries the risk of distortion. The shadow does not disappear just because one has faced it. It lingers, waiting for the moment attention slips. And so they remain vigilant, not in fear, but in respect for the truth that sovereignty must be guarded from within. In this way, their connection becomes a living practice, not a static achievement. For the sovereign feminine, this vigilance means holding to the same principles that kept her grounded in solitude. She does not dissolve into the connection, no matter how harmonious it feels. She does not abandon her rituals, her passions, her internal compass. She remembers that the very force that drew them together was her completeness, not her willingness to fragment herself for love. This is her anchor, ensuring that the union becomes a place of shared growth, not a slow erosion of self. For the sovereign man, the practice is much the same. He must resist the subtle pull of old masculine conditioning, the reflex to lead for the sake of control, the instinct to protect as a means of ownership, the urge to retreat when faced with emotional depth. His strength lies not in shielding her from her own storms, but in standing beside her through them. In this, he proves that his sovereignty is not fragile, that it can withstand the intensity of her full expression without shrinking. Together, they create an energy that unsettles those who witness it. People may project envy, admiration, or disbelief, sensing something in the bond that does not fit the common template. There is no visible struggle for dominance, no rehearsed performance of harmony, no unspoken desperation to keep the other from leaving. The connection feels simultaneously grounded and limitless, as though both could walk away at any moment and still remain whole, yet choose not to. This choice, made freely daily, is the source of its strength. And yet this kind of relationship demands more courage than most are willing to give. It requires the willingness to confront discomfort without fleeing, to own one's shadow when it surfaces, to speak truth without fearing loss. For many, the safety of a smaller love, one bound by predictable patterns and mutually tolerated illusions, feels easier. But for those who have tasted the expansiveness of a sovereign connection, there is no return to that smaller world. The sovereign feminine understands this fully. She knows that stepping into such a union means risking everything familiar, because the comfort of control does not exist here. What exists instead is the raw, unshielded presence of two people who have chosen to stand before each other without disguise. It is both exhilarating and terrifying, because the only thing holding it together is truth, and truth cannot be manipulated without breaking the bond entirely. This is why the meeting of two sovereigns is so rare, not because fate is cruel, but because few are willing to do the inner work required to hold that kind of space. It demands the death of every version of the self that relied on performance, strategy, or control. It demands the willingness to lose someone rather than betray oneself. And for the sovereign feminine, it demands a constant return to her own center, no matter how intoxicating the connection becomes. Still, those who witness such a union often wonder, if neither needs the other for completion, if both are content in solitude, what compels them to remain together? The answer is simple yet profound. They are not together to fill a void, but to create something that could not exist without both of them standing in their fullness. And that raises a question as old as desire itself. When two sovereigns meet, is their greatest challenge to keep the connection alive, or to keep themselves from being consumed by the vastness of what they have found? The vastness of such a connection is both its glory and its test. In the early days, the expanse between them feels like a horizon without end, a place where possibility stretches far beyond what either has known before. Every exchange feels weighted with meaning, every moment charged with the awareness that this is not an ordinary meeting of lives. But as time passes, the very depth that once exhilarated can begin to reveal its demands. Vastness requires navigation. It does not tolerate drifting for long without purpose. For the sovereign feminine, this means remaining vigilant to the subtle pull of complacency. Even the strongest unions can be eroded by neglect, not through great betrayals, but through the slow, unremarkable fading of attention. She understands that sovereignty within a relationship is not a static achievement. It is a living discipline. It is choosing, day after day, to meet the other not with assumption, but with presence. This requires her to continue tending to her own inner fire, for if she lets it dim, the union ceases to be a meeting of equals and becomes a quiet form of dependency. For the sovereign man, the challenge lies in resisting the temptation to define the relationship by its comfort rather than its truth. Comfort can be a seduction, lulling both into forgetting the raw honesty that brought them together in the first place. If he slips into the old patterns of control or avoidance, the connection will begin to shrink back into something familiar but lifeless. His task is to keep standing in the openness that once allowed him to meet her without projection or fear, even when the vulnerability of that openness feels almost unbearable. In Jungian language, this ongoing work is the continual integration of the shadow. Both must be willing to see and to show the parts of themselves that resurface in moments of tension, the impulses to withdraw, to please, to dominate, to hide. The union's strength lies not in avoiding these shadows, but in naming them, owning them, and refusing to let them dictate the terms of the bond. Without this practice, even sovereign love can decay into a repetition of old patterns, only dressed in more elegant clothing. There is another danger in vastness, the temptation to become so absorbed in the connection that the outside world fades into insignificance. At first, this feels romantic, two people existing in a world of their own creation, untouched by external noise. But over time, it can become a form of isolation that limits their growth. The sovereign feminine knows this and guards against it, ensuring that her life remains full, not just with him, but beyond him. She continues to build, to explore, to expand in ways that do not require his participation. This keeps her rooted in the truth that she is a whole being in her own right, not a half sustained by the other's presence. The sovereign man must do the same. He must nurture his own pursuits, his own circles, his own sense of meaning beyond their union. In doing so, he prevents the relationship from becoming the sole container for his fulfillment, which would place a burden on her sovereignty and erode his own. This mutual independence does not weaken their connection, it strengthens it, for it ensures that when they come together, it is by choice, not necessity. And yet, even with this balance, the vastness they share can feel daunting. It requires them to continually expand into it, to fill it not with distraction but with depth. This means asking the hard questions when Silence would be easier, showing vulnerability when pride would be safer, and celebrating the other's growth even when it leads them into territories where they cannot follow. In this way, the connection becomes not a fixed possession, but a living landscape that evolves alongside them. For the sovereign feminine, this is the highest form of union, not one that erases solitude, but one that honors it. A connection that does not demand she sacrifice the throne of her own life, but that allows her to share the view from it with someone who has built a kingdom of his own. In such a relationship, there is no need to collapse the other's ego, for both have dismantled their own illusions long before they arrived. But this brings us to a truth that few are willing to face. Even in the most aligned of unions, sovereignty means that either can walk away at any time, not as an act of punishment, but as a final act of self-respect should the bond ever demand the abandonment of truth. And knowing this, that nothing binds the other except their own free choice, can be both the most terrifying and the most liberating aspect of all. Which raises the final question that both must carry into every shared moment. Can they love each other as fiercely as they do now, even knowing that their sovereignty means they do not belong to one another at all? To love without possession is to stand on the knife's edge between ecstasy and surrender. It is to hold someone fully in the present, knowing that the future is not a promise carved in stone, but a living thing shaped by the choices of two free beings. The sovereign feminine understands this better than most. She does not anchor her love in guarantees. She anchors it in truth, and truth cannot be chained. It can only be chosen, again and again, or allowed to dissolve when it no longer aligns. This kind of love strips away all the illusions that keep lesser relationships afloat. There are no mind games, no strategic silences meant to provoke pursuit, no false compromises made to avoid conflict. Instead, there is a relentless commitment to reality, even when it is uncomfortable. She knows that without this, love becomes little more than a mutual performance, polished on the outside, hollow at its core. Sovereignty refuses to settle for that kind of emptiness. For the sovereign man, this love demands a strength different from the one he was taught to cultivate. It is not the strength of control, but the strength of release. It is the courage to let her stand fully in her power without trying to bend it to his comfort. It is the maturity to remain present even when her truth challenges his pride. This is a love that expands him, not because she completes him, but because she stands beside him as an equal force, one he cannot dominate, but only honor. In Jungian terms, this is the rare moment when the relationship becomes a container for individuation itself. Each partner becomes both mirror and catalyst, reflecting the other's depths and calling forth their highest self. But the danger of such a container is that it will not tolerate stagnation. If either stops growing, stops telling the truth, or begins to cling instead of choose, the bond will begin to fracture. The very structure that allows them to meet, as sovereigns, will become the same structure that pushes them apart. The sovereign feminine accepts this risk. She does not fear endings because she does not see them as failures. In her eyes, the only failure is to betray oneself in order to hold onto something that has already died in spirit. She has learned that love without truth is just attachment wearing a mask, and she will not wear it. She would rather walk away with her crown intact than stay and let it slip unnoticed from her head. This is not coldness, it is reverence. Reverence for herself, for him, and for the sacredness of the connection they share. Because when two sovereigns meet, the love between them is not theirs to control. It is something they serve. They tend to it like a flame, knowing that it will burn as long as it is fed, and that if either begins to starve it of truth, it will fade. And in that fading, they will not clutch the ashes, but will bow to what once was and let it rest. The beauty of this way of loving is that it magnifies the present. Without the illusion of possession, every moment together is alive with awareness. Words are not wasted. Touch is not casual. Time is not taken for granted. They live in a state of constant choosing, and in that choosing the connection remains fresh, not because it is new, but because it is never assumed. It is a living thing, born again each day by mutual consent. And perhaps this is the quiet truth behind the power of the sovereign feminine. Her ability to create ego collapse is only the surface of her influence. Beneath it lies something greater, the capacity to meet another in their highest form, without needing to diminish herself or inflate them to make the bond work. She embodies the paradox that terrifies the unready, that the deepest love is found not in holding tightly, but in standing side by side, free to walk away and free to stay. Still, one question remains for those who hear of her and long to meet her. Is such a connection the reward for becoming sovereign, or is the sovereignty itself the reward? Sovereignty is both the journey and the destination. It is the fire that forges the self and the light that guides it home. The sovereign feminine does not seek connection as an escape from solitude. She embraces solitude as the canvas on which her sovereignty is painted. Each moment spent alone deepens her roots, strengthens her boundaries, and sharpens her clarity. This internal kingdom, built stone by stone through trials and triumphs, becomes her true home. When connection comes, it does not fill a void. It expands what already exists. This expansion is not dependent on the other, but is amplified by their presence. She knows that the most magnetic power lies in wholeness, not in lack. This is why the sovereign feminine never chases, never begs, never loses herself in another's shadow. She moves through the world with the calm certainty of one who has faced her own darkness and emerged unbroken. This calm is a form of rebellion. In a culture that encourages women to seek worth through approval, the sovereign feminine's indifference to external validation is revolutionary. She embodies the truth that power is not taken, it is claimed. It is not given by others, it is born within. Her silence is a refusal to participate in the ego games that perpetuate insecurity, and in that refusal, she dismantles the illusions of control held by those around her. Her presence forces others to reckon with their own shadows. To the insecure masculine, she is a mirror of what is feared, autonomy that cannot be tamed, strength that does not demand submission, beauty that does not need explanation. To the awakened masculine, she is a partner in the sacred dance of mutual sovereignty, an equal in power and grace. For the listener, the invitation is clear. To embody sovereignty is to choose oneself over the lure of approval. It is to embrace the discomfort of standing alone rather than the ease of blending in. It is to understand that true attraction arises not from performance but from presence. It is to hold silence as power, boundaries as truth, and self-worth as unassailable. But sovereignty is not a static state. It is a living practice. It requires daily courage to face the shadow within, to resist the temptation of compromise that dulls the spirit, and to keep choosing authenticity even when it costs. It is the path of the silent oracle, the archetype who speaks most loudly through what is not said, who commands not by force but by unshakable presence. So the question remains for those who walk this path. Are you willing to create ego collapse, not through words or actions, but through the power of your own unshakable sovereignty? Are you willing to be the woman who does not chase, but who chooses? Share the moment you felt most empowered in the comments below. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.